Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Neha V. Singh, and I'll be your host for the day. Welcome to the second virtual panel discussion on the role of businesses in the net zero revolution under the Earth Care Initiative. Earth Care Awards is a joint initiative of JSW and the Times of India. It recognizes excellence in climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. The awards is in its 10th edition this year and is currently inviting entries across all categories. During the next 90 minutes, we will have many dignitaries joining us who will share their insights. I would like to invite Mr. Prabodha Acharya to briefly talk about Earthcare Awards. Mr. Acharya is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSW Group. Mr. Acharya has an MTech in environmental engineering. He has worked for nearly 3 decades in the field of corporate environmental management, emissions reduction, climate change, corporate strategy on sustainability, and policy development and assurance services. I would like to welcome Mr. Acharya. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sneha, for the generous introductions, and good afternoon to all of you. And I welcome to the second virtual panel discussions on the role of business in the net zero revolutions, which is very important for all. And I thank all the speakers today for their time, and most importantly to all of you who are participating today for this exciting discussion ahead. And but before we discuss and debate this subject, let me brief all about JSW Times of India Earthcare Award and why we do it. Can you please put the slide, please? Thank you. See, JSW believes in creating sustainable growth while balancing the use of natural resources. And it is committed to promote responsible behavior and value for social and environmental well-being. So JSW Times of India Earthcare Award are a direct reflection of JSW's commitment to the cause of environment. The Earthcare Awards seek to recognize, if we go to the next page, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. As Sneha already stated, that ECA is now into its 10th edition since its inception in 2008, and there have been 70 awardees till date. The award recognizes, verifies, and promotes the initiative and intervention on greenhouse gas emission reductions, natural resource management, energy efficiency improvements, development and promotion of innovative, eco-friendly alternative across sector. To name a few, 127 Territory Army Unit Uttarakhand, Jeremy Gujarat, ONGC, TCS, Ministry of Environment and Forest, Solidarity Bangladesh, MS Swaminathan Foundations are the past award winners. As you see, the awards will be given in 6 categories. Those are community-based climate actions, enablers for urban-centered climate change management, innovation in climate protections, business leadership in climate actions, women-led climate action initiative, enterprises in the renewable energy space. This is a new category we have introduced this year, giving the focus that how renewable energy is going to play an important role in climate change mitigations and adaptations. Next slide, please. And we are really fortunate to see that, next slide, please. And if you'll see that we have a line of distinguished jury members, and we are fortunate to have Dr. Raghunath Maselkar, who is the President Global Research Alliance, chairperson of our jury committee. We are also thankful to Rajat Gupta, who is Director McKinsey and Company, and he has kindly agreed to moderate today's session also, and you will listen more from him. We have Chandrabhushan, who is the founder of iForest and very renowned person in this field. We have Shlok Nath, who is acting CEO of India Climate Collaborative, and Dr. Aruna Ghosh, I think he needs no introductions. Thank you very much. And I welcome once again to this very important discussions today, building and knowing how important role the business are going to play in decarbonizing the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Acharya, for your insights. Next, I would like to introduce you all to Ms. Kiran Sarkar, who is the Head Sustainability Automotive Division, Mahindra and Mahindra Limited. Mahindra and Mahindra Igatpuri plant was a proud winner in the industry category during the 9th edition of Earthcare Awards. Welcome, Ms. Sarkar.
Hi, thank you, Sneha. Hi, everyone. So I'm talking from a winner's perspective. Mahindra Igatpuri is a factory which is actually has translated itself over the years, and it has gone from efficiency to conservation to efficiency, and then to rejuvenation part of it. Our chairman, Mr. Anand Mahindra, has always said that you have to challenge yourself, and sustainability or ESG is the next business opportunity. Taking that in mind, Igatpuri is a very small factory. It's actually an engine plant, but it has transformed itself, and it become the first, carbon positive certified company in India. What happened with this factory and the story? We have implemented this story at all our locations, and we have taken a big target of carbon neutrality of entire Mahindra by 2040. It's a big jump and big target that we have taken. And not only on carbon neutrality, but we have taken targets on other areas also. We have articulated 10 ESG commitments that cover environmental, social, and governance. Excessive carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a problem that the world is trying to solve. We have committed to be carbon neutral by 2040. Healthy oceans and vibrant vegetations are crucial to maintain balance in the carbon cycle. So we have committed to send the waste to landfill and grow 1 million trees a year, and are hoping to increase that to 5 million trees each year. It is said that climate change effects will manifest itself through water, and so we have committed to be water positive. This is how our environment commitments are connected to solving the climate problem. In the social space, we value the impact of educating and empowering girls and women. We have committed to scale that the work we do through our Nanni Kali program and educate 1 million underprivileged girls each year, and also enable livelihoods for 1 million women each year. Through these actions, we hope to drive positive change in society at a scale. Mahindra is respected for the high quality of governance in the way we run our business and engage with our stakeholders. We have committed to be gold standard in governance, and will do whatever it takes to sustain our stakeholders' trust in our brands and our businesses. Every one of the actions that we will take to achieve our commitments will benefit people and the planet. They will also positively impact our business. It is fair to say that our ESG goals are a way of living our brand ethos, which is RISE. So what message I want to give today is Earthcare Awards has given us this push and has helped us actually to understand how you can get benefit, and how you can improve this, implement this, and move ahead. So I would like to thank to the entire team of Times of India and JSW for this wonderful opportunity for us participating and then winning it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, now may I take this opportunity to invite Mr. Rajat Gupta, Senior Partner, Sustainability Practice, McKinsey and Company, who is our moderator for the session today. Mr. Gupta leads the sustainability practice in Asia, drives large-scale digital-led transformations in the energy and materials sector. Our speakers for today are Mr. Joe Fallon, Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, the premier CEO-led organization of over 200 leading businesses working together to realize a net zero, nature positive, more equitable world. Next, I would like to welcome Mr. Willem, Executive Director Supply Chain, Hindustan Unilever Limited, and Head Supply Chain, South Asia and SEAA. Also, joining us today is Ms. Aloka Majumdar, Head of Corporate Sustainability for HSBC India. Her expertise lies in the field of financial inclusion, skill development, and climate change. Our fourth speaker is Ms. Neeti Mittal, Head Compliance and Sustainability, Bharti Airtel Limited. She's a keen sustainability enthusiast and has been a catalyst in shaping sustainability practice at Bharti Airtel. We also have amongst us Ms. Prarthana Bora, who is the director of CDP India. Prior to joining CDP, she was the India director for Clean Air Asia. May I request Mr. Acharya to also join the panel, and let us begin our much awaited panel discussion. Over to you, Mr. Gupta.
Thank you very much, Sneha. Welcome to all the panelists. Before I get to questions for you, let me just frame the net zero problem a bit and the opportunity, frankly, more opportunity than problem, maybe even. I have 4 points to make here. I think the first one is that the net zero equation, or the 1.5 degree pathway equation, at this point of time, basis the commitments which have been made both by 90% of the world's GDP, countries comprising 90% of the world's GDP, as well as several thousand companies, that equation doesn't close yet. We are still, despite this, on the path to 2 to 3 degree warming, somewhere between 2 and 3 degree warming. That said, I do hope it is better than where we were 10 years ago in terms of commitments. And I do hope that the path will close. And the reason I'm confident that the world will move in that direction is because of my second point, which is that the pace of change has certainly accelerated. And at this point of time, based on what we perceive in certain markets, the demand for sustainable products or green products or decarbonized products is actually exceeding supply. So if you take, for example, green steel in, let's say, a market like Europe, which has an emissions trading scheme and a certain set of regulations, steel companies have to decarbonize by somewhere between 30 and 50% in this decade. So that means that 30 to 50% green steel has to occupy the 150 million ton market. And at this point of time, supply to that extent is not available. So in a sense, the demand signals are in place, and this has become, at least for now and the next decade, a supply problem. Asia and India's place, particularly in this, is quite unique. It is unique because a large proportion of possible climate refugees that we are likely to see are likely from India, and particularly because of heat stress, but also because of other climate-related problems. The second thing is that a country like India will have to invest a larger proportion of its GDP in land use systems, energy systems, and mobility systems to transform towards a decarbonized economy. India has to invest 11% of its GDP in the next 30 years towards net zero, versus the world, which has to invest 7.5%, where countries like US are at about 4% or 5%, and China also in a similar range, right? So a country like India has to invest a lot more because a lot of the country anyway has to get built. So Asia, India are in a unique place as far as this is concerned. Now, the investment also indicates and brings me to my fourth point, an opportunity. There's going to be opportunities to new businesses in automotive, in electric vehicles, in the energy sector itself through CCUS, for example, blue hydrogen. There's going to be opportunity for green hydrogen. There are going to be opportunities for new materials like nickel for batteries, and so on, so on, so on. So even as this is a space where companies have to think about downside avoidance, there are many, many, many new businesses to be created from the investment that's available. And therefore, my concluding point will be that companies, as they look at the downside, should look at the opportunity side of this. With that broader context, let me go to the questions for the day and to the panelists here. Maybe Joe, if I might start with you. you have an overview of commitments that have been made by businesses and the actions that businesses are taking. What is your view of where do we stand on a net zero transition, particularly from a business perspective? How ready is the industry? What keeps them awake on the path to net zero?
Well, thank you, Rajat, and thanks to everyone for organizing today. We're a global organization made up of more than 200 of the largest companies in the world, and including Indian majors like the Birlas, the Tatas, ITC, Godrej, UPL, and JSW, and globally companies like Unilever and McKinsey, who are here on this panel today. All sectors and geographies are represented, and we collaborate with our member companies to help them lead on climate, nature, and equity. And we recognize that business has the responsibility to act to keep the world within a safe operating space of just 1.5 degrees global warming, and to create green jobs, to deliver economic growth, and to build a more resilient society. And that all companies must align with the science and implement climate action plans to reach net zero carbon before 2050. And at WBCSD, we've made it a criteria of membership that our members do make that commitment. And we're supporting our members to achieve this, because for some businesses, it takes a lot of effort. But for others, it is extremely challenging, and not to be underestimated. But as challenging as it is for business to achieve net zero, and as challenging it is for society, and it is extremely daunting, it's much more achievable than adapting to a world with warming at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or even more. So there is no alternative other than to act with urgency. Through our SOS 1.5 project, we're supporting business commitments and initiatives to achieve the 1.5 degree goal by providing a framework for all companies to deliver and implement their climate action to net zero. So I think that businesses understand the direction, that's the way capital is going. And you talked about demand exceeding supply. And I think that we have to recognize that our economy isn't yet geared up to deliver the green products and services that consumers, capital markets, and increasingly regulators are seeking. So we help companies to ground their ambition in company purpose and to deliver and implement their commitments. And a critical part of achieving that is allowing companies to collaborate with their global peers and across their value chains, because that's where the action is hardest to create, hardest to measure. And so we support our members to work in their value chains to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy. And currently we're focused on projects in energy, transport, buildings, agriculture, nature, and industry.
Thank you, Joe. Just a quick follow-up for a short answer. What do you see companies actually doing? Are they on the pathway there? Are their targets bigger than are their ambitions bigger than their actions?
Sure. I mean, I think that most companies are more conservative in public than they are in the boardroom. And what we see is a lot of action. This is with the world's largest leading companies. We see a lot of action, a lot of very serious action and resources being put into decarbonizing. But that's not to underestimate the scale of the challenge.
Maybe one more follow-up before I move to the next person.
Sure.
What is keeping the boardrooms awake as they think about the path to decarbonization? Let me illustrate this for you, right? So in many sectors, some of which we'll talk about today, there is a question of adding capacity to meet growing demand, particularly in countries like India. And yet the technologies for doing that in a green, with a low carbon method aren't quite there yet. They aren't certainly mature. And so will some of those older technologies, if they put new plants with old technologies, with those plants get stranded? That's certainly something that I hear from boardrooms, CEOs.
Yeah.
What do you hear?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a race where legacy assets are profitable today, but either because of being ruled out from different financial instruments or things like carbon border adjustment taxes or new policy instruments coming in. suddenly they're going to become unviable or unoperable. And so the really hard thing for boardrooms is to understand at what pace they can transition and how to transition ahead of the pressure so that they can keep their competitiveness but be ready for what the future holds. And scenario planning is really important for businesses to understand that, and having distinct, vivid scenarios of how climate change, both physically and from a policy and regulatory perspective, might impact your business is a key tool for boards to assess and decide how they direct their investments and how they pace their transitions.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to turn to you, Prabodh, as perhaps the largest emitter in this room from a group perspective, but yet making essential products that build India: cement, steel, power. So how do you see the opportunities and challenges for your group? What's the discussion in the boardroom?
Thank you, Rajat. That's very pertinent question, but I'll refer to your earlier comment that business should look climate change as an opportunity rather than looking at only the threats. And we in JSW look this as an opportunity first. Second, yes, you stated that we are, obviously I'm the largest emitter in the room, but at the same time, the sectors you stated, steel, cement, and energy, are hard to abate. Means the way you make steel, the way you make cement, it requires carbon and it emits carbon. So therefore, it is hard to abate, but we believe it is possible to abate. That's the second point I wanted to make. The third point is that how do we see this? You look at whether steel or cement or energy, these are very essential elements of any modern society to grow. Even steel is ingrained with the society. We cannot even think of a decarbonized world or climate change mitigations or adaptations without thinking of having steel or cement. And in the same, suppose we want to transit to renewables, it requires huge quantity of steel and cement. So that is why I saw that is an opportunity. Even for example, the waste which we generate, blast furnace slag, that helps in decarbonizing cement sector. And that is where possibly JSW has looked at that opportunity and created cement business as a vertical, producing the lowest carbon footprint cement in the world. So that is why I stated that we are looking at those opportunity. But at the same time, of course, we will be in pressure to reduce our emissions. And that is where, if you look at in JSW Steel, we have given a commitment. We are going to reduce our intensity by 42% by 2030. We are going to achieve carbon neutrality in our energy business by 2050. By 2030, we will be building 20 gigawatt of our capacity, where 80% of those energy will come from renewables. We are looking at new energy sources also very seriously, although we are not very clear how it is going to play out, whether it is green hydrogen or other sources or storage energy. So that we are looking at very seriously. We want to remain as the lowest carbon emitter in the cement sector in the world. We will continue, and we are looking at how fast. I think by 2050, if we achieve a net zero in concrete. So these are our commitment, and we are seriously working towards it. So yes, there are challenges, but how we look at that, what we can do with the existing available technology. And second part, how we look forward for the possible technology that can decarbonize this sector, which is anyway hard to abate. The good news, Rajat, if you look at, if you want to decarbonize the entire steel sector, which is contributing almost 7% of the emissions and 0.7% of global GDP, you require only 0.1% of GDP. That's the good news I see.
Very good. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll turn to you, Niti. A very different, you represent a very different industry, a service sector, capital intensive, but nevertheless a service center. How relevant is even decarbonization for a technology company like yours? Is it even a topic that's discussed? You're on mute.
Thanks, Rajat. So yes, any emission saved is important, okay? And technology companies are leading it from the front. And decarbonization and climate change is definitely one of the top priorities which we are pursuing, okay? Not at our own company level, but at a telecom industry level. GSMA, which is our global organization, voluntarily passed a commitment that all telecom operators should adopt science-based targets. And way back in 2019, we had set this, we have taken a commitment to set the targets. And very proudly, I can say that Airtel became the first telecom company of India to have its science-based targets approved by SBTi in 2021. Okay, we are working to have a plan and implement that plan to halve our emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And there is a proper governance mechanism around it. We have an executive committee which is tracking our initiatives and the progress that we make. So it is very, very important, because even though telecom represents a very small fraction of the emissions, but still, as a responsible corporate, to whatever extent we can contribute to reduce our environmental impact, we would do it.
Let me maybe push this a little bit further, right? So one of the aspirations, we're also like you, a service firm, and McKinsey. And one of the aspirations that we have taken is, of course, besides getting our footprint down to zero, which is not that difficult because, like you, we don't emit that much, is to be the largest catalyst for decarbonization, private sector catalyst for decarbonization in the world. And I'm quite sure a company like Bharti would have similar aspirations. What do you see happening in your sector, in the either with your company or with other companies, the technology group, in terms of thinking big?
So, Rajat, definitely with 5G coming, our operations are gonna increase. The towers are gonna increase much than the normal one, the normal expansion rate. But yes, because we are committed to this cause, we would work in a way that we adopt most energy efficient technologies and renewable power wherever we can. We are committed that our data centers will use renewable energies by 2030. Our MSCs would adopt as much renewable energy as we can. Though we are a technology company, we have our own problems. We have got distributed sites. We would have some 2 lakh sites spread across India. And we can't use open access the way the hard-to-abate sectors can use. So we have our own limitations. But yes, we are working our way. We are kind of finding technologies which are cost efficient. We are doing infra collaboration with our companies so that we can use the same towers, which reduce on construction cost and the emission cost. And we are we had requested the ministry also that if the restriction on open access can be reduced, which would enable our towers to purchase renewable electricity, which would go a big way in meeting our targets. And yeah, we don't have a very clear path because this is a very aggressive target to reduce by 50%. But yes, there are a lot of difficulties and we are working towards it, and we are sure we'll be able to make it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neeti. Let me turn to you, Willem. As somebody who probably buys 80 to 90% of the total carbon in the form of either agri-produce or chemicals or packaging material, I presume, how does an FMCG company think about it? What are you thinking about it at Unilever?
Yeah, I think that first off, in Unilever is very much that we believe that going for carbon neutral is the only way that our business would be viable in the longer term. If we look at it from a consumer point of view, and you look at the different generations, so you look back at the baby boomers, for example, who are now, 60 to 80 years old, then you see that the majority is not particularly interested in the brand's social purpose, independently, whether that's an FMCG brand or anything else that you would buy. Generation X after that has more of that thinking in social purpose, but in practice, if you would put a questionnaire to the fore, you would get the answer back that yes, it's important. In the practice of what they buy, you don't see it really coming back. Now, the generation after that, Generation Y, you clearly see that they do buy products and services because of the brand's social purpose, but only if the price and quality is equal to what else is available. And the last generation now, from 0 to 20 or Generation Z, there you clearly see that they do favor brands that have that positive social purpose, even at the expense of price or quality of the product. So there is a very clear trend longer term that society is moving there. And in all honesty, if these are the consumers that are buying our products or the products from Airtel or from JSW, as we were just discussing, and that means that the only viable solution for companies over time to serve our consumers best would be to go on that net carbon transition, as well as I think a set of other commitments that many companies are making that work on the health of the planet, or confidence on well-being, or contributing to a more socially inclusive world. I do believe as well that if, as you just mentioned, that the majority of the carbon that we have in our end-to-end value chain is actually from the materials that we buy, the raw materials, the packed materials. They do form the majority, or even in the use of our products, if you sum those two up, you actually come to close to 98% of the carbon emissions over the life cycle of a product that we have in our value chain. And it's only 2% that actually goes into the making of our products in manufacturing. But it's very difficult to talk with, let's say, our suppliers, our partners, or with our customers, or with our consumers about what you can do to reduce your carbon emissions when you don't put your own house in order first. It's a little bit preaching without having your own practices well in place. So I do believe that it's very important that the first steps get made where, such to say, you put your own house in order. And that means the transition, for example, that we have for Scope 1 and Scope 2 of the energy use in our own operations, that first needs to be put in order. And we've been able to do that for electrical energy, where right now as HUL, or as HUL here in India, we have 100% of renewable electrical energy. We're very, very well on the way as well for heat generation, where we see some great examples as well of the movement into renewable energies. There is not only improving, obviously, the carbon emissions, but also it's contributing to less pollution in the areas where we operate. You clearly see as well that there is a positive effect as well on the employment of jobs, and it allows for new technologies to actually be developed a lot quicker than otherwise would have been possible. And I think as soon as we are able to make that work for ourselves in our own operations and bring the cost of these technologies down over time as well, you see that the adoption of those technologies with our partners downstream or upstream in the value chain becomes a lot easier as well, because of the knowledge that we have ourselves of how to implement this best, and the development of that technology that just makes it also commercially a lot more attractive.
Maybe there was a question on the chat around the role of MSMEs in decarbonization. As a company that deals presumably with your distributors who are MSMEs, or your suppliers, some of which may also be MSMEs, what do you see the role of MSMEs, Willem?
Yeah, I believe that there's a huge role to play for MSMEs in the decarbonization. I do see, actually, if I give the example of Something as simple as the transition that I was just speaking about from the black carbon fuels that we're using, for example, for heat generation, and moving that into biofuels. You actually see new MSME companies coming up because of the production of those biofuels. So I see a whole new industry developing that will be extremely attractive for MSMEs, new MSME companies, but also the expansion of business for existing companies that provide the services to or larger or smaller companies in their transition over the years to come. I also do believe that when the larger companies make some of the technologies that we spoke about earlier work, you suddenly see as well that they become attractive through that development for MSMEs as well. And we do know that we cannot achieve our objectives. You spoke about the 1.5 degrees earlier, and with the hope there that we get back on track to get towards that 1.5 degrees. We can't do that without MSMEs. And that means that the technology development and the experience of how to run operations in a carbon reduced or carbon neutral manner is something that the development of those technologies and the use of that needs to happen over time, that it becomes attractive and commercially viable for MSMEs as well. And I think then we are on the bigger path of that transition.
So I want to come back at some point on something that, let me just synthesize from what I heard, Willem, and what you said earlier, which is that only the 0 to 20-year-old customers or consumers are willing to pay more. Rest of us are not, including everybody in this room. And yet we know that for most part, there's going to be a 20 to 40% increase, 20 to 100% increase in the cost of manufacturing either energy or some commodities, certainly in the short term.
Right.
So there is a question here of how will this equation close, right? People are not willing to pay, and yet the costs will indeed go up. So I want to come back to that question at some point of time once we've done one round, but just to give you a little bit of time to think about this, everybody, this is a major conundrum. Customers are not willing to pay, and yet the costs are going to have to go up if the new technology has to get absorbed. Maybe that if I come to you, Aloka, from a financial institution perspective, you like us, the carbon you emit is in the electricity that you buy or energy that you consume in your offices and travel that your executives do. So it's not such a, decarbonization is not such a big deal. But is this, again, a top 3 topic for you? Why should it bother you at all as a financial institution?
So Rajat, I'll start with why should it bother us. So basically, I think, the climate clock is ticking fast, we all know. And we've seen that how the climate science is showing that, it's just not, it's not enough to reduce carbon emissions, but we have to stop it. And I think to just take from what Willem said, we also believe that, for your long-term survival, now this has become an imperative. It's not really something which is a good to do, but it is something more for your survival and more pretty strategic and very core to what we do. So that's something, I think that's the huge shift that we're seeing. In terms of, if you have to achieve the Paris Agreement target, I think every organization in the world has a part to play. And today, if you see most global corporations, and many large companies in India, and we just heard Prabodha, Nidhi and Willem, that, they're all setting very time-bound targets for themselves. So targeting time-bound net zero emissions, so which is a very big strategic change for these large companies. Now, as a financial institution, we can help. I think the most significant impact we can have is helping clients to transition to producing lower carbon emissions through financing and investment. So that's something that, as a financial institution, that's the role we can play. Very specific to HSBC, we are very clear that we want to be a leading bank in this space, supporting the transition of the economy to net zero, the global economy transition to net zero. And by net zero, we mean reducing emissions added to the atmosphere while increasing the amount taken out. So achieving a balance and not only protects the planet, but that builds a sustainable and thriving global economy. And, Prabodha mentioned that, it's just, you have to look at both the requirement on the one hand and the emissions and how you balance it. So there is and this is a complex thing, and it would require a very significant amount of investment. So I think that's where the financial institutions will play a big role, and of course, HSBC. I think for HSBC specifically, being a global bank and having an international reach, will mean that we can influence and shape fundamental changes. I think that's a big role that financial institutions will play in the net zero journey. And I think even Joe mentioned earlier that financial institutions are also looking at it as a huge opportunity. And we have to take it as a new opportunity. I think that's something which is quite clear. If you see that, if you see 10, 12 years ago, sustainability, became a key strategy for businesses around the world. But I think there's more to it. Investing in greener, sustainable and initiatives is more than just a trend today. What is critical is action. I think that is something which is the big change. From strategy to action is something which is the big change. I think as a financial institution, HSBC's focus is on powering new solutions to the climate crisis and, of course, supporting the transition to a low carbon future, moving to carbon net zero ourselves. And you mentioned that, also Neeti mentioned that, how these are now critical to what we do. In fact, I just wanted to mention 3 pillars around which our climate change efforts are being built. One is becoming a net zero bank. And when I say a net zero bank, we have said that we will manage and align our financed emissions, which is a very big deal, which is not going to be easy. When you say finance, it's our clients and customers we're talking about. So we want to align our financed emissions to achieve net zero by 2050 or sooner if possible. That's something that we have put on, as a target. And also we want to have our HSBC operations and supply chain to be net zero by 2030. And that's another, definitive term. And what we have planned to do is we want to now track it year on year. It's just not about making, targets and giving, just giving big numbers, but actually tracking it year on year. That's something that we would be very keen to do. The other thing that we have said by 2030, globally, we have committed to provide around $750 billion to $1 trillion in sustainable financing. And investments to support our customers make the transition to sustainable future. That's another big commitment that we've made. And the last one I wanted to mention is that of unlocking climate solutions and innovation. And, one of the big things that we are working on is to build one of the world's largest natural capital managers. That's something that which is a big focus for us. And on the innovation front, we are really looking at investing for a program for climate solutions partnership, where we have decided to invest about $100 million over the next 5 years. And it is basically going to aim at accelerating efforts to build a net zero economy and going to focus on 2 things: energy transition in emerging markets and also nature-based solutions, like, revitalizing wetlands, mangroves and forests, and to promote sustainable agriculture, etc., in, again, emerging markets. So these are the 2 things that we have focused on. So a lot to do, but I think the big change is, of course, completely the action piece. I think it's a big change that we are seeing in this space. So I'll stop here, Rajat.
Thank you, Aloka. That's very interesting. You're basically being a catalyst and a driver of change in other high-emitting industries, or where carbon can be removed from the atmosphere, like in your nature-based solutions. So thank you. That's very good to hear. Pratna, if I might come to you, one of the important things around this is going to be disclosure, tracking, measurement. What do you see happening? What's working? What's not?
Thank you, Rajat. That is really good to be here. I probably am the only non-business, other than Joe, of course, person here. And it's very encouraging. And we have the intent now in terms of doing something. We also have some kind of idea of the scale in terms of what we want to do. So I think scientific processes and methodologies are going to be very important in this whole process, because we want to do things right if we want to achieve the targets that we are aiming at. And this is probably where organizations like CDP come in, because, a tried and tested scientific methodology for helping and supporting corporates to reach their goals in terms of climate action is what we do. And this is probably evident from the fact that I just want to cite some figures, because Aloka talked about, how investing right is going to be the way forward. And we had in 2020 about 590 investors who asked us for data and who drove the climate and forest and water data which led to 14,000 companies worldwide disclosing to the CDP kind of a platform. So I think that kind of a data is very important because it is tedious to disclose in such data, but it also helps you assess and set the right targets. So I think someone spoke about the SBTs, right? The science-based targets. So I think that's the next step. So the first step is disclosure. So you learn to, kind of reveal your data in the context of what you are doing. And the second is, of course, setting the targets, which leads to the validation of these targets. And then finally, how do you achieve those targets? And this is the kind of platforms that, this is the kind of methodologies that we need in terms of a scientific process, which will allow us to assess our emissions and finding the right solutions which can lead to action. And there is an increasing, I think you asked me what works for companies, right? I think there's an increasing interest in disclosure, primarily because companies see a win-win situation in it. And this is something that came from the companies themselves. 70% of the companies who disclose to us, we asked them why they want to disclose, and they said it's good business because it helps them set good energy efficiency targets, reducing emissions, and this is like good costing in terms of achieving the right business policies so that it leads to climate action. The other was, of course, the reputation aspect, because it helps helps them get investments in the right direction. So I think these are areas which will obviously be will grow, and we will definitely have more of disclosure by companies, leading to targets and of course action which comes from disclosure. I'll stop there.
Well, let me just pick up on this as a question potentially directed at you, some combination of you and Aloka. One of the things that a CEO from a hard to emit sector told me is that ratings or disclosure leading to ratings gets them better access to capital, but does not get them a better cost of capital. Is that correct?
Would you like me to take that?
Either of you. Aloka, maybe you want to take that first, and then we can get Pratna also to add to that.
Yeah. So I think, Rajat, this entire space is evolving. And there is definitely a huge amount of push when it comes to ESG. And if you see, it's a given thing now that everybody from your regulators, everyone is looking at ESG now. So the entire lens in terms of how you're looking at financing is changing. So therefore, I would say that it definitely would have a huge, and I know there's a lot of work also on products, Rajat, at this point of time. If you look at the financing piece in the sector, there will be a lot of work on the products piece as well. So therefore, I think to answer your question, there will be, we think that this is an evolving space, and you'll see a lot of work that's going to go in terms of creating products for this sector, for sure. I hope I've been able to answer the question.
So Rajat, I just want to add that from an environmental perspective, I think, one of the things that we really need to keep in mind is there's a huge risk as far as climate is involved. And I think it is important for us to assess the risk. And as Aloka said, this is an evolving space. I mean, if you look at India, we hardly have an investor-driven disclosure or reporting system. What I quoted to you was a global investor demand in terms of putting the data out there. So I think there's a lot there in terms of how we assess or how we look at investments, which lead to sustainability investments. But I think the issue is that the recognition of the risk by companies in terms of what to expect as far as climate is concerned, I think that is what is going to lead this whole process. And this is where the calculations will come in. And I think there are leaders here in terms of both the investment community as well as in terms of the corporate community. And I think there will be ways in which we'll figure out how we reach there.
Wonderful, thank you.
Rajat, if you just allow me, I just share an example that how decarbonization strategy or sustainability linked financing. Obviously, you are absolutely right that it is opening of access to capital. But at the same time, although it is not directly, but there is indirectly helping in reducing the cost of those capitals. Like, when we went with sustainability linked bond for all three of our businesses, we have seen that there have been over subscriptions by 5 times, 6 times for the bond issuance. So what has helped is that tightening our, guidance value. in the interest rate. So in that way, possibilities.
So you did lower your cost of capital.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, that's new learning for me.
I mean, it's, I don't know how do you put it, but I see this is early phase, and people are, more people are willing to bet money on you.
That's interesting. Very interesting. I think we've got to get more examples like you. Will you be willing to declare how many basis points you got?
It's a different for 3 different business, but we could tighten by, I think, 0.35 or 0.45%.
Wow. Wow, 35 to 45 basis points.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's amazing. That's amazing. Very heartening to hear that. And I'm sure that a lot of the people listening today will catch on to that. That's a very big driver, I would say, for change. In a market particularly where we know the consumer is not willing to pay, except the 0 to 20, the regulator hasn't quite yet stepped in, of course, other than for power-related blending mandates and the PAT scheme. So we haven't yet seen an emission tax or an emission price come into play here. Right? So it's really good to see that the financial market is the first one to move here. Very good. All right, let's cycle back to you, Joe. And let me. So we heard from Willem that 98% of the emissions that relate to HUL's product or Unilever's products are in scope 3, right? And likewise, if you look at an automaker, it would be a similar number. 85% of them are in tailpipe, and about 13-14% are in the materials that go into making the car. On scope 3, how do you see action coming together across the companies that you work with?
Thanks. And that's an amazing example from Hindustan Unilever, that so much of their carbon footprint is out of their direct control, beyond what's inside the fence and the power that they consume. And that is the case for a lot of sectors. And so action in that scope 3 is particularly critical, but it's very hard to achieve today. And the main hurdle that our members have identified, and I hope Willem will validate this, is because of a lack of emission transparency. And there isn't a consistent methodology either for calculating or allocating carbon emissions at a product level. There's a lack of accurate, verified, and especially primary data. And a lot of the emissions that companies disclose in their carbon footprint and to platforms like CDP for scope 3, a lot of it is based on estimates. There's a lack of accurate, verified, and primary data coming out, and there's very limited exchange of emissions data across organizations and industries. So for the last 12 months, we have focused on how to unlock decarbonization to help companies achieve their net zero goals through real emissions transparency in supply chains. And we brought together a coalition which we called the Carbon Transparency Partnership. And its goal is to establish the global methodology and the technical infrastructure for accurate, primary, and verified greenhouse gas emission data exchange and measurement. And in practice, what this means is scope 3 for one company is scope 2 is primary, or scope 1 is primary emissions data for another company. It only becomes scope 3, according to where you are in the disclosure cycle. So the idea is that in practice, companies will be able to share their own primary GHG emissions data along value chains with a complete upstream product carbon footprint available at each tier. And this has become a really huge project with a lot of significant organizations involved. And already we've had achievements in 3 areas. So we've built an ecosystem to create alignment across value chains and industries with more than 50 WBCSD member companies, as I said, including Unilever and McKinsey, and 10 industry initiatives, including Watana's CDP, and together representing a total of 2,500 companies, but other stakeholders too. So we built this ecosystem. The second thing is on methodology, because our goal is to ensure consistent calculation and exchange of product level primary emissions data, building on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And at COP26 last year, we published version 1 of the upstream to downstream emissions accounting or rules for emissions accounting and exchange. So the principles for how you should account and how you should exchange. And the third area is to build the technological capacity and a network to enable confidential and secure exchange of verified emissions data. And late last year, we got commitment from leading tech players to collaborate on the creation of the network and work on some initial proof of concepts to exchange dummy data. So this carbon transparency partnership is helping to set the new rules of the game, creating industry agnostic guidance to calculate and report carbon emissions on a product level based on a high share of primary data. And when companies can see exactly where the hotspots are, they're then able to target and partner with those organizations in their value chain where the greatest potential for action and carbon abatement is, and achieve real decarbonization and make progress on their net zero emissions goals.
That's very interesting. Sounds a little bit like where money was 1,500 years ago, just invented, about to be used, measurement in trouble. I suppose even standards are very different, right? So all of this has to indeed get solved for. Willem, if I might come back to you with the question that we posed earlier around costs going up, but prices may not as much. And I think here, let me also throw one more complication for you to tease out a bit. Obviously, if there is a regulatory force like an emission trading scheme in Europe, then or blending schemes, you have to buy X% of reused packaging material, for example. They're blending mandates, then it becomes easier at some level. The additional question I have for you is, for a multinational like yourself, will you be forced to take different approaches in different markets?
Yeah, very good question. And I think, going back to the original question, there's obviously a big part that can help to equalize the playing field. If you think of taxes or incentives that could come through, that would make the transition to a low carbon economy with zero carbon emissions possible. I think we spoke about technology development as well, that technology development goes so fast that the costs for that are coming down very quickly, which means over the coming years, what is not commercially viable today will become commercially viable, at least for a part of the portfolio. Consumers are on the call today is offended that you wouldn't pay more for a product that has lower quality or cost more, but on average it comes down to what I said. I do think as well that Generation X or Generation Z that we were talking about, Generation Z 10 years down the line will be the 10 to 30s and will have a considerable buying power. So for companies to make that part of their competitive advantage over the years to come will definitely help. I think the question that I wanted to say one more thing on this, and I hope that helps, is I think for companies like ours, in order to make some of the carbon transitions work, it means that you need to look at a system change and not just as the examples that we spoke about here today. For example, the move from non-renewable energy to renewable energy. I find it for ourselves, if I give you one of those examples from HUL, India is the largest producer of tomatoes in the world. Now we produce tomato ketchup. Part of, and I know that as well for our competitors, the paste for ketchup is actually still cheaper in many ways when you import it out of China than it is in India, which intrinsically doesn't make any sense. But if you want to make that change, it means that the work that you need to do with smallholder farmers to make sure that the farming practices become sustainable, that with that the yield for smallholder farmers go up, that with that the quality of tomatoes go up, you suddenly can get to a system where you have lower carbon emissions, much less use of pesticides, higher crop yields, better quality, and therefore better income for the farmers. You get to a product that is actually lower in cost than the import that you would have out of China. So it becomes viable to do everything local, which obviously, again, in the carbon footprint makes a lot of sense because you're not shipping all across the world tomato paste. And it allows you to offer a better quality product at a lower price to your consumer. So it's very attractive there as well. But that is not something that will come with just one change in the value chain. It means that whole setup of the smallholder farmers, different type of aggregators, different contracts in place for companies like ours needs to come in place, that the whole system changes instead of just one of the elements. And that's an extremely important one. To your question on, is it the same everywhere? I think if I look at Unilever as a whole, the Unilever group, and not just HUL, then the Unilever group has put out its Compass commitments. You can find these on the web, but they go from the activities that we do in climate change up to the work that we do to achieve a waste-free world or to raise living standards. So a wide range of objectives, but the climate change objectives is what we're talking about today. These climate change objectives, as we have set them for Unilever globally, apply for our operations here in India as well. Now, there are differences in that program, differences because the reality in the markets are different. So if I talk, for example, I give you one example about plastics, which is related to carbon in the end as well. One of the commitments that we have made is to reduce the amount of plastics that we use in our packaging. Now, you see that the technology that we have today allows you to actually do lightweighting of bottles. So use a lot less plastic in bottles. You can move bottles, for example, or rigid plastics into flexibles. You can use alternative materials as well instead of plastics, although there the carbon footprint is not always positive for that. Now, the use of rigids is very much in Europe or in the US or in China, for example. But if we look at the type of plastics that are being used for packaging in India, that is mainly in flexible packaging and a lot less in bottles. And the technology for using PCR, recycled plastics into laminates, into flexible packaging, doesn't exist or not at scale at the right commercial value yet. So there you see that the reduction, for example, in plastics is really something that gets driven more by, in this case for us, in Europe and in the US and in China. But if you look at another objective that we have set, that is that we will collect 100% of our plastic footprint. The first country actually in the world that achieved that for Unilever is HUL, is Unilever India. And we were actually the first company to achieve that, first of the large FMCG companies to achieve 100% of the collection of our plastic footprint that we use for the production of our packaging materials. So you see that based on the reality of the market, I think some things go faster in one market than they do in another. But what's relevant finally for each of our markets will apply the same across. And that we see as well, because ultimately the demands that our consumers will have will converge over time towards a sustainable future and towards the wishes and the desires of Generation X that we were talking about earlier. And therefore, the same principles apply. It's just that the reality in the markets is different, and that means that the speed of certain initiatives goes faster in markets like India or faster in other markets where that is more relevant.
Thank you, Willem. I'm just going to request the panelists to raise their hands and jump in if they have a comment to add on some of these questions that we are, or some of these issues that we are grappling with at this point of time. Maybe let me turn to you, Prabodh, with a question around opportunities. So for an industrial group like yourselves, what do you think are the top 3 opportunities that these trends open up? Is it in recycling, like Willem said, collecting plastic waste, digesting it, recycling it? Is it somewhere else?
See, Rajat, as I opened these discussions that we look at climate change as an opportunity, business opportunity than a risk. Now we are in this sector. I mean, all these materials are needed. So if auto sector has to reduce the emissions, then they require high strength steel or green steel. So we see that is an opportunity. The way the energy transition happening in the renewable sectors, there will be a lot of requirement of the steel. Of course, they will require low carbon footprint of those steels, but there will be a demand. So that's an opportunity. And anything what we see, look, you build a climate resilient society, or tomorrow we have to build climate resilient structures. There also you will be requiring steel and cement. So we see those are the opportunity. And besides, I told you in the energy sector, so we are focusing on renewable energies, and that is a clearly business opportunity. And then in general, if you look at any business at the end, we have to find ways that will produce or we'll have a healthy bottom line to support all the things what we are going to do. And that is where the strategy gets changed. Now we see this opportunity will open up, and it is good for the business.
Thank you, Prabodh. I think we've heard of many opportunities here, right? I mean, Aloka talked about green products, green financing products, which seem to be at very early stages in their journey. You've talked about several. There was a question, if anybody can respond to it, around CCUS and policies around CCUS. I don't know if the panel is positioned to respond to something like that. You may be the best position, Pramod.
Yeah, I mean, just CCUS is something we are looking at very closely, and in fact, we are operating already a 100 TPD CCU project in one of the steel plants. In this hard-to-abate sector, CCU is going to definitely play a very important role in decarbonizing, because whatever the technology comes, we are not going to have a zero emission level. There will be some emissions. Now, how do we remove? I think this technological options is going to play important role. I see in India carbon capture and utilization as an opportunity, because you have opportunity now to use carbon in a cyclic manner. So it supports circularity. So capture this carbon and make it a product. Whether we do it with green hydrogen, we can produce sustainable biofuel, which will have high demand, ethanol, or any carbon, take the carbon molecule and put it to the use of other products, chemical products, and that replace that emissions itself. So that is where we see that carbon capture utilizations will have a very important role and good acceptability in India, rather than the storage. That will be a very not only technological challenge, also the economical challenge are there. How we do that. So yes, if you look at is a good opportunity for the industry? Yes, it is a good opportunity. As far as part of the policy is concerned, I think we are in the early stage. If you look at in US or Canada or Europe, companies are being funded by governments to support carbon capture and storage, and that is yet to come here. We need to see some policy movement, but yeah, I mean, carbon capture and utilization is one of the solutions which we are also keenly looking at.
Willem.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, because CCUS usually gets referred to when we speak of the hard-to-abate industries, but it's interesting to see that even for the FMCG industry, we now see that some of the materials that we are using in the production of our goods. So in our laundry products, for example, we use soda ash in the washing powders. And that soda ash, part of the soda ash that we use today, is actually being produced through carbon capture, where with Tuticorin alkali chemicals and carbon clean solutions, we have developed the technology for the production of soda ash through carbon capture technology, and are using that in our laundry powders today. And that's the type of technology that we're looking at for this year to scale that up significantly, as well as roll that out to other plants in our network. So it's clearly something where the technology development has gone so quickly that what used to be a utopia only 6-7 years back is something that becomes reality today. And that gives me a lot of hope as well that for other materials that we use as well, that technology can be used in a commercially viable manner in the years to come to make the transition to carbon neutral materials.
If I might just add a couple of my own words on CCUS, I think there are 3 steps or 4 steps to this. Each letter is a step. So if you look at capture, I think the thing to think about there is what is the concentration of the stream of carbon dioxide, because the cost of capture can range from $5 to $150 from processes. And if it's air capture, it's $500 a ton of carbon dioxide. So I think that's something that's very important to think about. It's important to think about on the use stage, the usage stage, on 2 things. One, what will be the cost to use carbon to make methanol, which then can go and be blended into fuels, synthetic methanol. And also to think about what the magnitude of use will be, right? So in many of these applications, for example, dry ice, people talk about that. It's a small use of carbon dioxide. On the other hand, methanol for blending, if we can get to a reasonable commercial level cost for getting that done, that could be a very large use for blending purposes. So I think the magnitude and the cost and the usage stage become important. And then on the storage front, there is, of course, the question of storing in empty gas fields or oil fields today, which is possible to some extent. But more importantly, geological exploration to see if we can actually store this very far down in the ground, which 0 of which has been done in India. Frankly, we are underexplored from a mining perspective, and we are super underexplored from a carbon storage perspective. There was one other question on the chat. Let me take that and see if anybody else has a perspective on saying, look, EVs. So what's the point of having EVs? Yes, they will abate tailpipe emissions, but they will add emissions for the battery and battery-related materials that will have to be put in the EV. I don't know if anybody has a perspective. Joe, it's yours.
Thanks. So I thought exactly the same when I've been in India for 12 years, and I thought an electric vehicle solves none of the problems, doesn't help with traffic, it doesn't give access to more people, to mobility, and it's all powered by coal, so what's the difference? But actually, it's not true. So already today, an EV powered by the grid as it is has a lower greenhouse gas footprint than an ICE. That's the first thing. As the grid brings more renewables into it, it will take advantage of that straight away. And of course, there's massive benefits in terms of air quality, which Prathana knows more about than any of us, except we all breathe it, so we understand. So already there are really big benefits, and those will only grow. So and then the other thing is, of course, that EVs will have a role in balancing the grid and putting more storage into the grid effectively. So they're extremely important and should be pushed. And a lot of work is happening already. Now, it's a big sector for India. I think it accounts for, vehicles accounts for about 45% of manufacturing jobs in India. The change is coming, the transition is happening. It's going to happen with two-wheelers really quickly. And passenger vehicles won't be far behind. And, you know, companies are looking to get ahead of it and be part of that transition too. It's going to happen very fast.
Can I just add something, Rajat?
Please.
Yeah, so I think this is where probably, you were going to ask me a question on policy, and I just want to bring this in because I think the coordinated efforts is going to be very important. And I'd like to quote something that I, recently read in a report by the IEA, which kind of did a projection. So, the whole issue of measurement also comes in here. So if you look at the present policies in terms of, mobility and transportation, Government of India's policies, if in the present state, it is expected to reduce, transport-related emissions by almost 60% by 2040. But, you need to correlate it because the road transport demand is increasing. And how do you balance the two? Because if you don't, if it needs to, you need to look at the road transport, the demand from the perspective of what Joe just mentioned. I mean, should we transition to EVs? Should we transition to policies related to, designing our cities better so that, you have access to non-motorized transport and you alternative methods of transportation. So I think just looking at EVs in isolation is where the problem is. And we do need to look at a more coherent and coordinated approach to policy. Take the case of captive power plants. Captive power plants predominantly work on coal. But if you look at emission control measures that have been proposed, and if these emission control measures are adequately adapted, then the emissions from these power plants would reduce considerably. And if you add to it renewable energy targets, the ambitious renewable energy targets, then we would actually have substantial reduction in emissions. But the problem is that, are we going to be able to actually meet those standards and implement the emission control measures? And this is where probably the question arises, because I think we have to work on both policies together. It's not about an energy policy or a mobility policy, but an integrated approach in terms of how we look at these multiple issues and figure out the coherent methodologies to kind of implement them is probably the way to go, rather than look at sectoral interventions in isolation. Stop there.
Thank you very much for transitioning us to this policy question. I'm just going to throw that open and maybe get a quick comment from everybody on what should India's policy approach be?
Rajat, I'll come in, though I'm just of course going to look at the finance side of the, if you take policy on the finance side, we are looking at a very large target, right? I mean, I think a CEW report says that we will require upward of $10 trillion for us to achieve the 2070 net zero target that we have. And there's no doubt that both the banking regulator and the government of India are taking measures in terms of, encouraging sustainable finance. But what we see is that the cost of sustainability is high, right? So therefore, at this point of time, there will have to be some blended finance or incentivized, options that will need to be given to ensure in a certain time frame, so that it takes off, the momentum gathers. So that way, a policy push also on the financing side will be very, very useful for the sector at large. And you have to see that, somebody asked about the EV question. There's going to be a huge amount of investment in technology. And therefore, that's one of the imperatives. So therefore, it will require a huge amount of investment. So I think that from the perspective of getting some incentives, I think it's definitely going to drive that in the initial stage to gain momentum, and then before we get into to a stage. And we've seen that, India has done a great job when it comes to renewables, right? We've seen the journey, or energy efficiency. We've seen it over the last 10, 12 years. So I think that's something which is a big policy push, perhaps would be helpful in this space.
One of the things that I feel with India having declared a 2070 aspiration for net zero, what it does is it does give us a bookend as a country. And when we have that bookend, we then have to, of course, think about when will we peak, what the pathway down to the 2070 period will be, to zero will be. But what it does, it does give us an opportunity to be much more stable with our policies. For example, one of the issues that's always brought up is that we moved to Bharat 6 or Euro 6 standards as far as vehicles was concerned. And obviously that required a significant amount of investment in many different parts of the automotive value chain. And then we are rapidly needing to move to EVs. And so that investment may not get paid back. So there is discussion around these things. Hopefully some of that will happen because some technologies will move so quickly. For example, coal is redundant today on a pure economic basis, even perhaps, or getting there soon. So some things will move from a technology perspective. That uncertainty can't be anticipated. But perhaps from a policy perspective, what this does is give us an opportunity to develop a national plan and then work towards that. I remember when I worked on the solar mission 10, 11 years ago, and one of the things that we thought about was doing it in very small chunks until things became more proven. And then the tailwinds came, solar prices went down. Some of the few things that we jointly put in place with the government at that point of time actually helped the sector take off. So I think thinking about policy in that way is very important. I know many of you encounter policy in different ways. We'd love to hear any other perspectives on this, Prabodh, from you, from Neeti, from you. Joe, if you
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, Rajat, I think it's very important that India has put aspirations to net zero. So that is important. We know where we are leading. So now the policy will be moved towards when we will peak, what should be the sectoral decarbonization pathway and how it will bring in the required finances in different sectors to give that initial push. And if I take the example of solar, what you are telling, the study tells the technology diffusion has been 30 times faster than possibly the best optimist which they could have thought of. So therefore, when you have something to achieve and you know the end game, then everything will come together and will move in the right directions. So there will be, obviously, there will be no one policy intervention. There will be multiple policy interventions will happen. And I think it has started happening in India. If you look at the hydrogen policy, the way it has moved so fast. Last year only we declared hydrogen mission. And now we have the first phase of hydrogen policy declared. And, all the government mechanisms are pushing it faster. So, before we could realize that things will take time, it has arrived. So in my view, I think it will change so fast, even beyond our expectations. And there, everything has to come together, including the initial policy push. The business also will make a tremendous impact in those changes, because everything is come together when money is linked. Aloka, so you have a great role in pushing and giving the required finances to all our business to make this happen. And I have seen it happening. When it is linked to the business benefit or the money, it moves very fast.
Right.
So maybe that's a good point to ask Aloka a sharp question on funding. I talked about some of the funding needs. India has an exceptionally high funding need. India and Africa, those are the two parts of the world that have the highest level of funding needs. This is according to McKinsey Global Institute's recent research. Not only is that funding need high, it's also front-loaded, right? So if you think about from now to 2030, a disproportionate part of that has to be spent in the next 15 years if we are to get to that 2050 net zero point. And now in that context, where's the money going to come from? One place I can see it coming from for sure is inflation. Prices going up of products.
Right.
Where else is it going to come from, Aloka?
I think Rajat, it's going to be this is going to be an interesting story. I think we see multiple players actually coming into this picture. If you take India, very specifically, if I'm talking about India, we were just discussing with the business heads. And one of the, we were talking about two accelerators when it comes to India, and that could infuse more energy in the sector. And one was actually the priority sector lending piece. Because, you're talking about agriculture, you're talking about agriculture, of course, being an agrarian economy, that's a large part of it is actually sustainable financing. So you will see that, I think there is an opportunity for defining and, the qualifying matrix of such assets, the PSL assets. I think that's an interesting thing. This is purely, I'm quoting my colleagues, the business heads. The other thing is, Rajat, is that, considering the country's requirement to build substantial infrastructure assets. And I think there's going to be, from the policy, and there's going to be a fair amount of manufacturing mix, which is going to come up. I think is something that when we're talking to the government, we hear about it. And Prabodha talked about the hydrogen piece already. I think what will be required is large multilateral financial institutions and the international credit guarantee providers to come together to offer long-term credit traps. I think that's something which is going to be quite critical, because that will encourage the commercial banks to look at financing such projects. That's something is I think that's something purely from my colleagues who are heading the sustainable business part is what we hear from. And you're absolutely right. It's important to, finding the phenomena that will power the change over the next 20, 30 years. That is going to, I guess, will be the big challenge for us.
Wonderful. We are at the end of our time. So unless somebody has a burning comment, let me bring this to a close with maybe I think we've covered a lot of ground, right? But if you think about the path to net zero, or path to decarbonizing the earth, there are three building blocks that we talked about. We talked about the physical building blocks. We talked about technological innovation within that. We have to create new supply chains, the scope 3 discussion that we had. And we have to get at new natural resources, land, for example, for solar, or nickel for batteries. The second block is economic and also societal adjustments. So we talked about the behavior of customers. We talked about capital reallocation that has to substantially shift. New products have to come to play. Demand shifts have to be managed, and cost structures and cost shifts have to also be managed. And then there are going to be people who will be left out of this. So how do we compensate them? And then the third block is governance, institutions, commitment that we have to make. We will need support from citizens in this journey. Otherwise, you'll have elected governments who will go out of power and will want to go back in the opposite direction, right? So that's something that's going to be important. Collaboration. So Joe, you talked about that, and Prabodh, you talked about that. Collaboration between the public, private, and the social sector is needed. And then standards. So I think these three blocks, unless they come together really well, the physical block, the economic societal block, and the governance and institutions block, we are not, well, let me say it in a positive way. When these blocks come together, which we're beginning to see parts of, is when we will see us heading towards net zero. With that, back to you, Sanjukta. Thank you, everyone. Thank you really for a wonderful debate.
Thank you.
Sorry, Sneha, back to you then, not Sanjukta.
Yeah, thanks to you, Rajat, for conducting this amazing discussion. And thank you all for joining us as panelists for such an interesting discussion. And we also have a small message by Mr. Sonam Vanchit now, who is an engineer, innovator, and education reformist. So let's have the video, please.
Climate change needs action today, now. Efforts like the EarthCare Awards, which is a joint initiative of JSW and the Times Group, are the need of the hour. The award recognizes innovative, transformative solutions that address both climate change and wider environmental challenges and eventually bring them to the center stage. This is a great opportunity for anyone working on climate change in India and the SAARC countries. The 10th edition introduces a new category dedicated to recognize exemplary work in the renewable energy space. They hope to encourage focused participation from companies in renewable energy generation space. Let us all come forward and contribute to make this planet a better place to live.
Wow, the video is indeed a very powerful one and sending across a very strong message to all of us. So thank you all for joining us today. It was a pleasant discussion, and of course, please log on to earthcareawards.com to explore more about the awards and also submit your entries. Have a pleasant evening. Goodbye. See you.